Right now, something inside you is on the verge of breaking. Not bending, not stretching, breaking. Maybe it started with one thing: a loss, a failure, a diagnosis, a conversation that changed everything. Or maybe it has been building so slowly, so quietly, that by the time you noticed the weight on your chest, it had already become part of your daily existence. Either way, you are here. And the fact that you are here means something important. Some part of you has not given up. Some part of you is still fighting to understand why the mind behaves the way it does under pressure, and more critically, what can actually be done about it. Here is what nobody tells you at the beginning of a hard season. The battle you are losing right now is not with your circumstances. The job, the relationship, the money, the future that feels like it is collapsing. None of that is the real fight. The real battle is happening inside your own skull, in the space between what happens and how you respond to it. And that battle, unlike the external chaos that triggered it, is one you can genuinely win, not by suppressing what you feel, not by forcing yourself into false positivity, but by understanding, at a biological, psychological, and philosophical level, exactly what is happening inside your mind when life refuses to cooperate, and then building, deliberately and systematically, the kind of inner architecture that does not collapse when the ground shifts. This is not a motivational audio experience. You will not find empty encouragement here, no breathe and believe affirmations, no surface-level advice designed to make you feel momentarily inspired before the next difficult morning arrives and strips that inspiration away entirely. What you will find is something far more durable: the science, the psychology, and the unfiltered truth about what it actually takes to construct a mind that remains functional, grounded, and genuinely capable under the full weight of what life can deliver. You are going to understand why your mind behaves the way it does when pressure rises. You are going to learn the mechanics of panic, the neuroscience of calm, the psychology of identity, and the philosophy of endurance. And then you are going to receive a complete, practical, layered system for training yourself, not just to cope, not just to survive, but to fundamentally transform the way you encounter difficulty. Here is what most people fundamentally misunderstand about calm. They treat it as a personality trait. They look around at certain individuals, the ones who seem unshakable, who stay composed when everything is in free fall, who keep moving forward when others freeze, and they conclude that those people were simply born different, built differently, wired for steadiness in a way that most people are not. That assumption produces either envy or defeat, and neither one moves you forward. That belief is wrong. Calm is not inherited. It is constructed. It is a skill, and like every skill that has ever existed, it can be learned, practiced, sharpened, and ultimately mastered by anyone with the willingness to do the work. By the time you finish this audiobook, you will not just understand that skill intellectually. You will possess it as a lived, embodied reality. Let us begin. The first thing you need to understand is what your brain is doing right now, in this moment, and in every single moment of your conscious existence without exception. It is building a model, a continuously updated, extraordinarily detailed internal map of how the world operates, what to anticipate, what is reliable, what constitutes safety, what signals danger. Your brain constructs this model automatically and without any conscious participation from you, drawing on every experience you have accumulated, every pattern you have ever registered, every outcome you have ever learned to predict. And woven into the deepest architecture of that model is an assumption so fundamental, so thoroughly embedded in the structure of your psychology, that most people never examine it at all. The assumption that you are in control, not omnipotent control. You are probably not naive enough to believe you govern the weather or the economy, or the decisions of other people. But in the quiet interior of your own mind, there exists a belief the brain genuinely requires, that if you plan carefully enough, work diligently enough, and make wise enough choices, then life will largely proceed in the direction you intend it to. That belief is not stupidity, it is a survival mechanism. The brain depends on a sense of predictability to function efficiently. It needs to feel that its model of the world is reasonably accurate, that its forecasts are reliable, and that the effort invested in understanding cause and effect will be rewarded with outcomes it can anticipate. Without that sense of predictability, the brain cannot prioritize, cannot plan, cannot rest. Without it, every moment becomes a potential emergency. So the brain constructs the illusion of control with extraordinary care. It builds it through routine, the quiet comfort of doing familiar things in familiar sequences, which generates the sensation that the day is navigable. It builds it through planning, the relief that accompanies writing things down, setting goals, making lists, as though the act of articulating an intention grants you power over whether it materializes. It builds it through expectation, the deep, often unspoken conviction that because you have put in the effort, because you have done what was required of you, the outcome you are hoping for is somehow owed to you. The promotion, the stability, the relationship that thrives, the future that matches the image you have been carrying. And then something happens. Something unplanned, unseen, undeserved, and the model shatters. This is the moment most people describe as life falling apart. But what is actually occurring at the neurological and psychological level of how the mind processes reality is not that life is falling apart. It is that the illusion is falling apart. The map your brain constructed so painstakingly has been contradicted by reality. And your nervous system's reaction to that contradiction is not philosophical curiosity. It is alarm, raw, visceral, full-body alarm. The panic you experience when the diagnosis arrives, when the relationship ends, when the job disappears, when the financial reserves run dry. That panic is not a sign of weakness. It is not evidence that the situation is necessarily as catastrophic as it feels in the moment. It is a sign that your brain's model of the world has just been invalidated, and your survival systems have activated to manage what they register as a life-threatening level of uncertainty. This is why people who are otherwise intelligent, capable, and resilient can completely fall apart when things go wrong. It is not because the difficulty exceeds their limits. It is because the loss of perceived control initiates a neurological cascade that renders clear thinking nearly impossible. And here is the crucial point that changes everything. As long as you believe the goal is to recover control, to fix the situation, solve the problem, restore the order, you will remain trapped in an exhausting cycle of panic and depletion, because you are waging a war that cannot be won against the fundamental unpredictability of existence itself. The philosopher Epictetus, who endured years as a slave before becoming one of the most consequential thinkers in human history, identified what may be the single most important distinction a person can internalize. He called it the dichotomy of control. Some things are within our power, he observed, and some things are not. Within our power are our opinions, our impulses, our desires, our choices, our responses. Not within our power are our bodies, our reputations, our positions, the actions of other people, the conditions of our lives. Epictetus argued that virtually all human anguish is rooted in the persistent refusal to honor this distinction. We spend our energy frantically trying to control what we cannot, while neglecting the only domain where our power is absolute: how we respond to whatever happens. This is not passivity. It is not resignation. It is not an instruction to stop trying to improve your circumstances. It is something far more precise and far more powerful. The goal is not control. The goal is clarity. The goal is to become so clear about what you can genuinely influence, your thoughts, your actions, your interpretations, your choices, that you stop hemorrhaging psychological resources on everything that exists outside that domain. Researchers studying locus of control have documented this with considerable consistency. People who believe their lives are primarily shaped by external forces, other people's decisions, luck, conditions beyond their influence, consistently show higher levels of anxiety, depression, and helplessness, alongside measurably lower levels of resilience and well-being. People who believe that their responses and choices, even within genuinely difficult circumstances, are the primary driver of their experience, consistently demonstrate stronger mental health, greater resilience in the face of adversity, and significantly better outcomes over time. The difference is not in the circumstances. The difference is in where people believe their agency resides. The first step in training your mind to remain steady when life becomes hard is not a breathing technique or a mindset adjustment. It is a fundamental philosophical reorientation. It is the decision, made consciously, deliberately, and returned to repeatedly, to stop measuring your stability by whether things are going according to plan, and to start measuring it by the quality of your response to whatever is actually unfolding. When you make that shift, everything changes, not because the chaos disappears, but because you stop granting the chaos the power to determine your interior state. You stop being someone who is calm when life cooperates and shattered when it does not. You become, instead, a person whose calm does not depend on circumstances at all. That person is who this audiobook is building. And it starts with accepting, not reluctantly, not performatively, but genuinely and fully, that control was always an illusion, and that releasing it is not a loss. It is liberation. Now, if you have ever been in the center of a real crisis and discovered that you could not think clearly, could not access your reasoning, could not recall basic information, could not locate the perspective you knew you were capable of, you were not imagining it. Your thinking brain was genuinely not available to you in that moment. And grasping exactly why that happens, in biological terms, is foundational. You cannot build a calm mind without first understanding the mechanism you are working with. Your brain is, among its many functions, a threat detection system of remarkable sensitivity. Buried deep in the central region, within the limbic system, sits a small structure called the amygdala. The amygdala's primary function is to scan your environment ceaselessly and automatically, without any conscious input, for signals of danger. It processes sensory information faster than your conscious mind can, which means that by the time you are aware that something threatening is occurring, your amygdala has already been responding to it for several hundred milliseconds. It has already dispatched alarm signals throughout your brain and body. It has already initiated the release of stress hormones, principally cortisol and adrenaline, that prepare you to fight, flee, or freeze. This response is ancient. It evolved across hundreds of thousands of years to protect human beings from immediate physical threats, predators, falls, starvation, hostile tribes. And it is extraordinarily effective for that specific purpose. When you are in genuine physical danger, the amygdala's rapid, automatic response is precisely what you need. It saturates your body with adrenaline, sharpens your senses, accelerates your heart rate, redirects blood flow away from digestion and toward your large muscle groups, and transforms you into a faster, more reactive version of yourself. All of this occurs in a fraction of a second and can save your life. The problem is that your amygdala cannot distinguish between a predator and a difficult conversation, between a collapsing structure and an unsettling email, between physical danger and financial uncertainty. To the amygdala, a threat is a threat, and when it fires, when it determines that what you are experiencing right now constitutes a danger requiring an emergency response, it does something critical to understand. It suppresses the activity of the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is the region of your brain that makes you human in the most meaningful sense. It governs rational thought, long-term planning, impulse regulation, empathy, nuanced decision-making, the capacity to weigh consequences, the ability to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously. It is your wisest self, the part of you that thinks before acting, examines options deliberately, and makes choices aligned with your deepest values rather than your most immediate fears. When the amygdala shifts into alarm mode, the prefrontal cortex goes offline. This is what researchers call the amygdala hijack, a term introduced by psychologist Daniel Goleman, and it accounts for why thoughtful, intelligent people say and do things in moments of crisis that they would never say or do in a composed state. Their wisest self has been temporarily overridden by their most primitive self. And here is where it becomes critical for our purposes. This hijack is not confined to sudden, acute emergencies. Chronic stress, the kind generated by sustained periods of difficulty, uncertainty, financial pressure, relational conflict, or any situation that keeps your threat detection system on prolonged alert, gradually erodes the balance between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex in a way that makes you structurally more reactive over time. Neuroimaging studies have demonstrated that people who experience chronic stress show measurably larger amygdalae. Their threat detection systems have literally expanded in response to repeated activation. And they show measurably reduced gray matter density in the prefrontal cortex. The brain is physically altered by sustained stress. The regions responsible for panic grow stronger. The regions responsible for wisdom grow weaker. But here is the counterbalancing truth, and it is among the most important scientific findings of the past 2 decades. The brain is also physically changed by calm, by deliberate, practiced, sustained calm. The research on neuroplasticity, the brain's lifelong capacity to restructure itself based on repeated experience, has fundamentally transformed what scientists understand about the human mind's potential for change. The brain you inhabit right now is not fixed. Every time you practice a calming technique, every time you consciously select a regulated response over a reactive one, every time you breathe with intention in a moment of stress, you are establishing new neural pathways and reinforcing existing ones. You are literally rewiring your brain at the cellular level. Landmark research by neuroscientist Sarah Lazar at Harvard Medical School found that people who practiced mindfulness meditation consistently showed increased cortical thickness in the prefrontal cortex and reduced amygdala volume and reactivity. Their capacity for rational thought had physically grown. Their capacity for automatic panic had physically diminished. These were not metaphors. These were measurable structural changes in brain tissue, produced by nothing other than consistent mental practice. What this means for you is genuinely hopeful. The reactive, spiraling, panic-prone version of your mind that you may have come to regard as simply who you are, that is not a permanent condition. It is a current configuration of a highly adaptable organ, and the configuration can be changed. Not by wishing it would, but by giving your brain the right kind of repeated experience. The experience of pausing before reacting. The experience of breathing through discomfort. The experience of choosing observation over catastrophizing. Done consistently and with genuine engagement, these practices do not merely adjust your behavior, they alter your brain. And an altered brain changes everything about how life feels when it becomes hard. Understanding the neuroscience is not sufficient on its own to generate calm, but it accomplishes something essential. It removes the shame. It dismantles the lie that you should simply be able to handle this, that the fact you are spiraling is a character flaw, that stronger people just do not fall apart the way you do. No. Stronger people have trained their brains to regulate differently. And now, you will too. Of all the practices this audiobook will introduce you to, if there is a single one that is more immediately accessible, more universally available, and more thoroughly validated by modern science when it comes to interrupting the cycle of panic and restoring the capacity for clear thought, it is the breath. Not because breathing is simple. Not because it is a beginner's tool you will eventually graduate beyond, but because the breath is the only function in your body that is simultaneously automatic and subject to voluntary control. That unusual dual nature makes it the most direct lever available to you for reaching into your nervous system and manually shifting its operational state. To understand why controlled breathing works the way it does, you need to understand the autonomic nervous system, the network that governs all the bodily functions you do not consciously manage: heart rate, digestion, immune response, hormone release, blood pressure. The autonomic nervous system has two primary branches. The sympathetic branch is your accelerator. When it is dominant, your body is in a state of mobilization, heart rate elevated, breathing rapid and shallow, muscles tense, senses sharpened, cortisol and adrenaline flowing. This is the stress response. The second branch is the parasympathetic system, your brake. When it is dominant, your body is in a state of recovery. Heart rate slows, breathing deepens, muscles release, digestion resumes, and the prefrontal cortex comes back online. In an ideal situation, these two systems would alternate fluidly and appropriately. But for most people navigating sustained difficulty, the sympathetic system becomes the default. The body gets stuck in high gear, and the longer it remains there, the more difficult it becomes to shift out. Because a chronically activated stress response literally alters the sensitivity of your threat detection systems, rendering you more reactive, not less. Here is where the breath becomes your most powerful resource. Of all the functions governed by the autonomic nervous system, breathing is the only one that responds directly to your deliberate control. Your heart rate will not obey your conscious commands. Your digestion will not either, but your breathing will. And when you regulate your breathing deliberately and specifically, you directly influence the vagus nerve, the longest nerve in the body, running from the brainstem through the heart, lungs, and gut, serving as the primary channel through which the parasympathetic system communicates with your organs. Slow, deep, diaphragmatic breathing directly stimulates the vagus nerve, which directly activates the parasympathetic response, which directly lowers your heart rate, reduces cortisol, and returns your prefrontal cortex to active function. You are not just settling your mind, you are chemically and neurologically shifting your body's entire operating state using nothing but your own breath. One of the most effective techniques to emerge from contemporary physiology research is what neuroscientist Andrew Huberman calls the physiological sigh. Throughout the day, particularly during periods of stress, the small air sacs in the lungs, the alveoli, tend to partially collapse, reducing oxygen exchange and contributing to the physical sensation of anxiety and tension. The physiological sigh, a double inhale through the nose, followed by a long, complete exhale through the mouth, immediately reinflates those alveoli and produces the fastest possible reduction in physiological arousal. You take a full breath in through your nose. Then, before exhaling, you take a second sharp sniff to completely fill the lungs. Then you exhale slowly and fully through your mouth until the lungs are empty. Done even once, This generates a measurable and immediate drop in heart rate and stress hormones. Done 2 or 3 times consecutively, it can shift your entire physiological state within 60 seconds. Another profoundly effective method is box breathing, used by Navy SEALs, elite athletes, surgeons, and anyone whose professional existence demands the ability to remain composed under extreme pressure. Box breathing creates a rhythmic, equal count pattern that engages the parasympathetic system while simultaneously giving the anxious mind something concrete to anchor to. You inhale slowly through the nose for a count of 4. Hold, lungs full, for a count of 4. Exhale completely through the mouth for a count of 4. Hold, lungs empty, for a count of 4. That is 1 cycle. Practiced for 4 to 6 cycles, this technique reliably produces a state of calm alertness, not drowsiness, not sedation, but the specific combination of relaxed body and activated mind that is optimal for both performance and clear decision-making. The 4-7-8 technique, developed by Dr. Andrew Weil and rooted in ancient pranayama practice, is particularly effective as a reset for acute anxiety or panic. Inhale quietly through the nose for 4 counts. Hold the breath for 7 counts. Exhale completely through the mouth for 8 counts. The extended exhale is the key physiological element. The exhale phase activates the parasympathetic response, so making the exhale longer than the inhale consistently and powerfully engages the calming branch of the nervous system. Grounding techniques work alongside breathwork through a different but complementary mechanism. The 5-4-3-2-1 technique is among the most widely practiced and most effective. In a moment of anxiety or overwhelm, you bring your full attention to 5 things you can see right now. Then 4 things you can physically feel: the texture beneath you, the temperature of the air on your skin. Then 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, 1 thing you can taste. This technique operates on the understanding that anxiety is almost always future-focused. It inhabits scenarios that have not occurred yet, catastrophes that exist only in imagination. Grounding forces your attention into the present moment, into concrete sensory reality. And the prefrontal cortex, which processes present-moment sensory information, begins to reactivate as a direct result. What is essential to grasp about all of these techniques is that their power is not in knowing about them. It is in practicing them until they are instinctive. The person who reaches for box breathing the moment panic begins to set in does so because they have practiced it hundreds of times in moments of relative calm, building the neural pathway that makes the technique accessible even when their nervous system is under significant load. You cannot wait for the crisis to arrive and then attempt to recall the method. You practice the method now, daily, deliberately, so that when life delivers something genuinely difficult, the response is already wired in, already available, already part of who you are. This is the foundation. The understanding of how your brain operates under threat, the knowledge that calm is built rather than inherited, and the practical command of the physiological tools that can interrupt the spiral and return you to ground. Everything built on top of this foundation, every insight and every practice in the chapters ahead depends on this base being solid. And now it is. There is a difference between having an emotion and being an emotion. Most people have never encountered this distinction, and because they have not, they experience every difficult feeling as a total event, something that swallows them completely, that they are entirely inside of, with no separation between the one who is feeling and the feeling itself. When grief arrives, they do not observe grief. They become grief. When fear emerges, they do not notice fear from a distance. They are fear. And because they are the emotion rather than the one experiencing it, they have no vantage point from which to select a response. The emotion simply acts through them, directing decisions, coloring words, governing behavior, while the person supposedly in charge watches helplessly from inside the storm they are simultaneously identified with. The skill this section teaches is among the most transformative you will ever develop. It is the ability to create what psychologists call psychological distance between yourself and your emotional experience, to become, even in the midst of intense feeling, the one who is observing the feeling rather than the one who is consumed by it. This does not mean suppressing your emotions or pretending they are absent. Emotional suppression is one of the most psychologically destructive strategies a person can employ, consistently linked to elevated anxiety, deteriorating physical health, damaged relationships, and long-term emotional dysregulation. What it means is something far more sophisticated. Feeling fully, while simultaneously maintaining enough of an observer's perspective to prevent the feeling from making all of your decisions for you. Acceptance and commitment therapy, one of the most empirically supported psychological frameworks developed in the last 3 decades, uses a technique called cognitive diffusion to help people establish this distance from their thoughts and emotions. The core insight behind diffusion is this: you are not your thoughts. Thoughts are events in the mind. They arise, they occur, they pass. They carry content, sometimes painful, sometimes frightening, sometimes overwhelming content, but they do not carry inherent authority. A thought that insists everything is ruined is not a factual report. It is a mental event. And the moment you can perceive it as a mental event, rather than living inside it as though it were objective reality, you recover enormous psychological freedom. The thought does not vanish, but its grip on your behavior loosens dramatically. One of the simplest and most effective diffusion techniques is linguistic reframing. Instead of saying to yourself, "I am overwhelmed," you say, "I notice I am having the experience of overwhelm." Instead of, "I am terrified," you say, "I notice my mind is generating fear right now." This small linguistic shift creates a subtle but profoundly important separation between the observing self, the stable, continuous you that witnesses your experience, and the content of that experience. You step even slightly outside the weather of your emotions, and from that slightly outside position, you can choose your response rather than simply being driven by the feeling. Research led by neuroscientist Matthew Lieberman at UCLA found that the act of labeling an emotion, putting it into words, naming what you are experiencing, measurably reduces amygdala activity and increases prefrontal cortex engagement. In brain imaging studies, simply articulating, "I feel angry" or "I feel afraid" produces a detectable shift in neural activity away from reactive, threat-focused regions and toward more reflective, regulatory ones. The act of naming creates distance, and distance creates choice. This is not a metaphor. It is observable biology. The RAIN technique offers another framework for moving through difficult emotional experiences without either suppressing them or being consumed by them. RAIN stands for recognize, allow, investigate, and nurture. You begin by recognizing what is happening, naming the emotion clearly and honestly. I am feeling grief. I am feeling rage. I am feeling fear. Then you allow it. You stop fighting the feeling, stop attempting to push it away or argue yourself out of it, and instead give it permission to be present. The paradox of emotional experience is that resistance amplifies. The more vigorously you fight a feeling, the louder it becomes. Allowing it, acknowledging its presence without feeding it or acting on it, is what begins to reduce its intensity. Then you investigate with genuine curiosity rather than judgment. You explore where the emotion resides in your body. Where do you feel this? What does it feel like physically? What belief or unmet need is beneath it? Investigation moves you from being inside the emotion to examining it from alongside it. And finally, you nurture, bringing the same quality of genuine care to yourself that you would naturally extend to a close friend who is experiencing exactly what you are experiencing right now. Not minimizing, not dismissing, but honestly kind. Journaling is one of the most powerful and most underutilized tools for creating emotional distance. Psychologist James Pennebaker's research on expressive writing, the translation of emotional experience into language, has demonstrated in dozens of studies that this practice reduces psychological distress, improves immune function, lowers cortisol levels, and significantly strengthens long-term emotional regulation. The mechanism is direct. When you write about what you are feeling, you externalize it. You take something that was swirling formlessly inside you and give it structure, boundaries, and a location outside your mind. Once it has an external location, you can examine it rather than being trapped within it. Even 15 minutes of honest, unfiltered writing about a difficult emotional experience has been shown to produce measurable benefits that persist for weeks. The deepest truth about emotional distance is this: you are not trying to feel less. You are learning to feel in a way that preserves your capacity to function, to choose, and to grow. Emotions are not problems to be resolved. They are information. They communicate what matters, what has been violated, what you genuinely need. The goal is to receive that information clearly, which requires enough distance to hear it without allowing it to override every other source of wisdom available to you. The person who can sit with grief without becoming grief, who can feel fear without being governed by it, who can experience anger without being weaponized by it, that person is not emotionally diminished. That person is emotionally free. Now consider one of the most psychologically devastating things that happens to people when life falls apart. They lose themselves. Not in a vague, metaphorical sense, but in a very specific and measurable sense. The self they understood themselves to be, the one defined by the role they held, the success they had built, the relationship they sustained, the status they had earned, the future they were assembling, suddenly no longer exists. The business fails, and the entrepreneur does not know who they are without it. The marriage ends, and the spouse cannot recognize themselves in their own reflection. The diagnosis arrives, and the healthy, capable person they believed themselves to be evaporates overnight. The position disappears, and the identity built around competence and professional worth collapses alongside it. This is not weakness. This is what occurs when identity is constructed on circumstances rather than character. And it is one of the most prevalent and most destructive ways human beings build their sense of self, attaching who they are to what they possess, what they do, what others believe about them, and what their life appears to be from the outside. Because all of those things, every single one, can be taken. And when they are taken, the person built on top of them has nothing left to stand on. The Stoic philosophers devoted considerable time and care to this problem, because they inhabited a world where the conditions of a person's life could shift catastrophically and without warning. Marcus Aurelius, emperor of the most powerful civilization on earth, a man who commanded armies and governed millions, wrote extensively in his private journals about what he called the inner citadel, the unassailable interior fortress of character and values that no external event could penetrate. The body can be confined, he wrote. The reputation can be dismantled. The possessions can be stripped away. The position can be revoked. But the character, the commitment to virtue, to reason, to responding with integrity to whatever arises, that cannot be touched by any force outside yourself. It is the one thing that is entirely and permanently yours. Modern psychology has arrived at essentially the same understanding through an entirely different route. Acceptance and commitment therapy places significant emphasis on what it calls values-based living, orienting behavior around core values rather than around the pursuit of specific outcomes or the avoidance of specific feelings. Values are fundamentally different from goals. A goal is an outcome, something you either achieve or you do not. A value is a direction, a quality of being and acting that you can embody regardless of what your circumstances look like. You can value courage even when you are terrified. You can value kindness even when you are treated unkindly. You can value integrity even when dishonesty would be considerably easier. And because values, unlike goals, cannot be blocked by circumstances, an identity rooted in values is structurally immune to the kind of collapse that an identity rooted in circumstances will always be vulnerable to. This distinction has enormous practical consequences for how you experience difficulty. When your identity is primarily successful entrepreneur and the business fails, you lose not just a business, but yourself. When your identity is primarily a person who acts with integrity, who keeps showing up, who treats people with respect, who refuses to be defeated by adversity, and the business fails, you lose a business. That is genuinely painful. But you do not lose yourself, because the failure does not contradict or erase any of the values-based qualities that define who you are. If anything, how you respond to the failure becomes another occasion to demonstrate and deepen those qualities. The crisis becomes, paradoxically, not the place where your identity is destroyed, but the place where it is clarified. Psychological flexibility, another central concept from acceptance and commitment therapy, and one of the most robustly researched predictors of mental health and resilience, is the capacity to remain connected to your values and continue moving in the direction they point, even in the presence of difficult thoughts, painful emotions, and deeply unfavorable circumstances. It is the ability to be moved without being swept away. To feel the full weight of what is happening without losing your bearings. Research consistently demonstrates that psychologically flexible people feel just as intensely as anyone else, but they maintain a relationship with their values that is stronger than their relationship with their current emotional state, which means they can act from their deepest self, even when that self is hurting. How do you construct this kind of identity? It begins with clarity. Most people have never explicitly defined their core values. They live by implicit, unexamined values, absorbed from family, culture, conditioning, without ever having chosen them deliberately. And implicit values cannot anchor you because you do not know they are there until they are tested. The first step is to sit with the question genuinely, without rushing. Who are you when you strip away everything that can be taken? Not what you do, not what you have, not what others think of you, but what you stand for, how you treat people, what you refuse to compromise, what kind of person you are committed to being on your worst day, in your hardest moment, with the least to show for it. Write it down, not as a performance for anyone else, not as a brand declaration or a social media statement, as a private covenant with yourself. These are the qualities I will carry into every situation life presents. This is who I am, regardless of what my life currently looks like. This is the foundation beneath every role I play and every objective I pursue. Because foundations matter most when everything above them is shaking. And when you have a foundation that is genuinely yours, built from your own examined values, expressed in your own honest language, tested and refined through your own lived experience, you discover something remarkable. You discover that the external chaos no longer has the power to generate internal chaos. Not because life becomes easier, but because you finally know with a certainty that circumstances cannot touch exactly who you are. There is a counterintuitive truth at the center of human psychology that most people spend their entire lives resisting, and the resistance itself is what sustains the suffering. The harder you fight against what is happening, the more power it accumulates over you. The tighter you grip a reality you cannot alter, the more that reality controls your interior state. The more energy you direct into refusing to accept a painful situation, the more of yourself you surrender to it, until the situation is not merely something you are navigating, but something that has thoroughly colonized your mind and made your inner life a continuous war against what is. This is the acceptance paradox, and understanding it is not just intellectually interesting. It is one of the most practically liberating shifts in perspective a human being can make. When most people hear the word acceptance, they hear surrender. They hear passivity. They hear a kind of resigned, defeated giving up that is fundamentally incompatible with strength, ambition, or the will to change difficult circumstances. That interpretation is entirely wrong, and it must be addressed directly before going any further. Acceptance, as it is understood in psychology, and as it will be used here, has nothing to do with approving of what has happened. Nothing to do with deciding that what occurred was acceptable, and nothing to do with abandoning the desire or effort to improve your situation. Acceptance means one specific thing: acknowledging without resistance that what has happened, that what currently exists, that reality as it stands right now is what it is, regardless of whether you believe it ought to be different. That distinction is everything. Because you can fully accept a reality and simultaneously work with every resource available to you to change it. What you cannot do, what no human being can do and remain psychologically intact, is effectively address a reality you are refusing to acknowledge. Resistance to what is does not alter what is. It only layers the suffering of resistance on top of the suffering of the original circumstance. The distinction between psychological pain and psychological suffering is one of the most useful in the entire field of human well-being. Pain is the direct experience of something difficult, the grief of loss, the fear of uncertainty, the ache of failure. Pain is largely unavoidable. It is the natural, honest response of a conscious being to a world that does not always cooperate with what we need and want. Suffering, however, is what occurs when we add our resistance to the pain. When we insist to ourselves that this should not be happening, that it is unbearable, that we cannot manage, that life has failed us, that this should not be our reality. Suffering is pain multiplied by non-acceptance, and unlike pain, which cannot always be controlled, the degree to which we suffer is something we have far greater influence over than most people realize. The research on acceptance as a psychological practice is substantial and consistent. Studies examining the outcomes of acceptance and commitment therapy compared to more conventional approaches consistently demonstrate that people who learn to practice genuine acceptance of difficult internal experiences, thoughts, emotions, memories, physical sensations, report lower levels of overall psychological distress, greater functional well-being, and significantly greater resilience when encountering future adversity. Not because their circumstances were more favorable, but because they stopped fighting the wrong battle. Buddhism arrived at this same understanding thousands of years before modern psychology codified it formally. The second noble truth identifies the origin of suffering not as painful circumstances themselves, but as craving, the relentless insistence that things be different from what they are. This is not fatalism. The tradition that teaches acceptance of what is also teaches compassionate, purposeful action to reduce suffering in the world. Acceptance and action are not opponents. They are partners. Acceptance liberates the energy that was locked in resistance and makes it available for the kind of clear, grounded, deliberate action that actually generates change. Here is what genuine acceptance feels like when you practice it honestly. It does not feel like surrendering. It does not feel like indifference. It often feels, initially, like grief. Because accepting reality fully means releasing the version of reality you had been insisting on. The one that would have been, should have been, could have been. You grieve the plan that did not materialize, the relationship that ended, the version of the future that will not unfold the way you envisioned. And on the other side of that grief is something remarkable: clarity. The mental resources that were entirely consumed by resistance, by the exhausting, endless argument with what has become available again. And in that availability, you find that you can think, choose, plan, and act more effectively than you could at any point when you were still fighting the reality you were living in. Releasing is not weakness. Releasing is the act of a person who has decided that their energy is too precious to waste on battles that cannot be won, and who is preserving it instead for the battles that can. There is also a relational dimension to acceptance worth naming clearly. When you stop resisting your own reality, you stop requiring others to validate your resistance. You stop needing the people around you to confirm that what happened was unfair, to endlessly reinforce the story of what should have been different. This need, real and understandable as it is, quietly corrodes relationships over time, because it asks other people to remain in the pain with you in a way that prevents both of you from moving forward. Acceptance liberates not only you, but the people who care about you from the gravitational pull of an unresolvable argument with the past. And in that liberation, something genuinely new becomes possible. Not the old life restored, but a new one, built with clear eyes on the actual ground beneath your feet. There is one more dimension of acceptance that is rarely discussed, but carries extraordinary weight in lived practice. The relational dimension. What acceptance does not just to your interior experience, but to the way you show up for the people around you. When a person is locked in resistance to their own reality, they become consuming, not deliberately, not maliciously. But a mind at war with what is cannot be fully present to anyone or anything else. The conversations circle back. The same wounds get reopened and examined and narrated again. The need for validation of the grievance becomes, over time, more prominent than the connection itself. The people who love you want to help. They want to be there. But there is a limit to how long anyone can serve as a witness to resistance, without feeling the relationship beginning to hollow out. Acceptance changes this. When you stop needing the external world to confirm that your reality is unfair, you free yourself to actually inhabit your relationships again. You become capable of genuine curiosity about other people's lives. You recover the capacity to be interested, to be present, to give rather than only draw. This is not a small thing. In a period of sustained difficulty, The quality of your connections is one of the primary determinants of whether you emerge intact or diminished. And acceptance, the quiet, unglamorous, deeply courageous act of releasing the argument with what is one of the most powerful ways to protect and strengthen those connections precisely when you need them most. There is also something important to say about the timing of acceptance. People sometimes hear this concept and feel an immediate pressure to arrive at it, as though the failure to accept a painful reality quickly is another failure to add to the list. That interpretation causes real harm. Acceptance is not a destination you reach by forcing yourself. It is a direction you move in gradually, with honesty, and without self-coercion. For some experiences, the movement toward acceptance takes days. For others, it takes years. And there are seasons within that movement where the resistance surges back, where grief reasserts itself, where the anger that felt resolved returns with fresh intensity. None of this indicates that you are doing it wrong. It indicates that you are human, and that the experience you are processing is genuinely significant. The work is not to accept on a schedule. The work is to keep orienting toward acceptance, to keep noticing when you are in resistance, to keep choosing, one moment at a time, to release the grip slightly, to allow reality to be what it is while you decide, from as grounded a place as you can access, what you want to do about it. That ongoing orientation, imperfect, non-linear, sometimes painful, is what makes the difference. Not the achievement of some pristine, untroubled state of peace with everything that has happened, but the genuine, sustained commitment to stop spending your most irreplaceable resource, your attention, your energy, your capacity to be present, on the war against what is, and to begin directing it instead toward what could be, toward the life that is actually available to you now, in the circumstances that actually exist, with the person you are continuing to become through all of it. That is where the real work lives, and that is where the real freedom waits. Your brain, as it exists right now, carries a bias. Not a moral bias, not a philosophical one. A deeply embedded neurological bias toward threat. It is called the negativity bias, and it is not a character flaw. It is an evolutionary inheritance from ancestors whose survival depended on their ability to detect danger faster than they registered safety, to remember pain more vividly than pleasure, to scan their environment for what could go wrong rather than cataloging what was going right. The brain that protected your ancestors was one exquisitely attuned to threat, one that could identify the rustle in the grass that might signal a predator and sound the alarm before any conscious thought had formed. That brain is your brain. And while the environment has changed beyond recognition, while the threats you face today are almost never physical, almost never immediate, and almost never the kind that require a body flooded with adrenaline, the threat detection hardware has not been updated. It is still running on ancient programming in a modern world. Every email that reads like criticism, every conversation that feels charged, every uncertainty about the future that your mind turns over at 2 in the morning. Your amygdala processes all of it with the same fundamental alarm architecture it would deploy against a genuine physical danger. The result is a nervous system that is chronically overactivated, a mind that is perpetually scanning for what could go wrong, and a baseline psychological state that sits far closer to anxiety than to peace. Not because life is genuinely dangerous, but because the brain has not been trained to distinguish between threats that demand emergency mobilization and difficulties that require thoughtful engagement. The good news: and this is grounded in decades of neuroscience research, is that the negativity bias is not fixed. It is a default setting, not a permanent condition. And defaults can be changed through deliberate, consistent practice. The work ahead is understanding the specific mechanisms by which the threat response is maintained and amplified, and then constructing the counter-practices that systematically reduce its dominance and create in its place a new default. One oriented not toward panic, but toward calm, not toward threat scanning, but toward accurate assessment of what is actually happening. The first mechanism to understand is rumination, the tendency of the anxious mind to replay distressing events or anticipated dangers over and over, as though thinking about the problem enough times might solve it, as though worrying about what could go wrong might prevent it. Rumination feels productive. It feels like problem-solving. But research by Yale psychologist Susan Nolan-Hoeksema, who spent decades studying repetitive negative thinking, found that rumination is one of the primary drivers of both depression and anxiety. Not because it generates useful solutions, but because it keeps the nervous system in a state of sustained alarm and strengthens the neural pathways associated with negative emotional processing. The more you ruminate, the more skilled your brain becomes at ruminating. The more you practice threat-focused thinking, the more automatic threat-focused thinking becomes. The counter-practice is not positive thinking, not the forced, artificial insistence that everything is fine when it clearly is not. The counter-practice is what researchers call cognitive reappraisal, the deliberate, honest examination of a threatening situation to identify alternative interpretations that are equally valid but less catastrophic. When you receive critical feedback, and your immediate interpretation is that you are failing and will soon be exposed as inadequate, cognitive reappraisal asks, what else could this mean? Could it mean that the person giving feedback believes you are capable of improving? Could this be information you can use to grow rather than evidence of your fundamental inadequacy? The goal is not to deny the difficulty, but to expand the range of possible interpretations beyond the most threatening one. And because the brain's threat response is driven by interpretation rather than raw facts, expanding interpretation reliably and measurably reduces threat activation. The second mechanism is avoidance. When something triggers anxiety, a difficult conversation, an overwhelming task, a situation associated with past failure, the instinctive response is to avoid it. And avoidance works beautifully in the short term. It immediately reduces the discomfort. But over time, avoidance teaches the brain something deeply damaging, that the avoided thing is genuinely dangerous, that you cannot handle it, that the comfort of escape is preferable to the discomfort of engagement. Every time you avoid, you reinforce the threat response. The avoided thing grows larger and more formidable in your mind, and you grow smaller in relation to it. The counter-practice is graduated exposure, the deliberate, progressive engagement with the things that generate anxiety, structured in a way that allows the nervous system to learn through direct experience that the threat is manageable. This principle underlies virtually every effective anxiety treatment in existence. Exposure does not just reduce avoidance, it literally rewires the brain's threat associations. When you approach something that frightened you and discover that you can handle it, not that it is pleasant, not that it is comfortable, but that you can handle it, the amygdala's alarm response to that stimulus weakens. The neural pathway linking that situation to danger is undercut by the competing evidence of your actual experience of surviving and navigating it. Repeated enough times, the new association becomes dominant. The alarm quiets. What was once a source of panic becomes something you can face with steadiness. The third mechanism is the body itself. The body does not merely express the mind's emotional states, it feeds them. Chronic muscle tension, shallow breathing, poor posture, and sleep deprivation all generate physiological conditions that the brain interprets as threat signals, which in turn elevates threat detection sensitivity and increases the likelihood of reactive, panicked responses. This is a bidirectional loop. The mind activates the body signals back to the mind. And it means that training the body is not separate from training the mind. It is part of the same project. Regular physical exercise has been demonstrated in numerous studies to reduce amygdala reactivity, increase prefrontal cortex activity, and produce lasting reductions in baseline anxiety. Adequate sleep, 7 to 9 hours of quality rest, is not indulgence. It is a neurological requirement for emotional regulation. Sleep-deprived brains show up to 60% greater amygdala reactivity than well-rested ones. The person who wants a calmer mind must take genuine responsibility for the physical conditions in which that mind is operating. Rewiring the threat response is not a short-term project. It is a sustained effort composed of small, daily, deliberate choices, each one incrementally shifting the balance of your neural architecture away from reactive alarm and toward grounded calm. Choosing to reappraise rather than catastrophize, choosing to approach rather than avoid, moving your body and resting it adequately, practicing the breathing and grounding techniques from earlier until they become instinctive. Done consistently, these choices do not merely modify your behavior. They alter who you are at the level of brain function. They change your baseline, and a different baseline changes everything. Inside your mind right now, there is a storyteller. It has been active your entire life, a narrator, a running commentary on everything that is occurring around you and within you. It tells you what events mean. It tells you what people think of you. It tells you what the future holds, what you are capable of, what you deserve, and what is fair. It connects the dots between past and present and projects them forward into predictions about what is approaching. And here is what most people have never been told about this narrator, the understanding that changes everything once you possess it. The narrator is not reporting reality. It is constructing it. The stories you tell yourself about your life are not neutral transcriptions of fact. They are interpretations, shaped by your past experiences, your deepest fears, your most entrenched beliefs, the emotional state you occupy when events occur, and the narrative framework you have assembled over years of living. Two people can move through an objectively identical experience, a job loss, a rejection, a conflict, and generate completely different stories about it. One person's story. This is a disaster that proves I am not good enough and that good things never last for me. The other person's story. This is painful and unexpected, and it requires me to find a different path, and I have found different paths before. Same facts, radically different narratives. And those different narratives produce radically different emotional experiences, physiological responses, decisions, and outcomes. The story is not a reflection of reality. The story shapes reality. Cognitive behavioral therapy, one of the most thoroughly researched and validated psychological treatments ever developed, is built almost entirely on this insight. The core principle is that it is not events themselves that produce emotional and behavioral consequences. It is our interpretation of events. The same principle was articulated by Epictetus 2,000 years ago. It is not things that disturb people, but their judgments about things. And research by psychologists Aaron Beck and Albert Ellis has demonstrated thousands of times that systematic examination and revision of the stories people tell about their experiences produces measurable and lasting improvements in emotional well-being, even when the circumstances themselves remain entirely unchanged. Under pressure, when life is genuinely difficult and the stakes feel high, the storyteller does not become more accurate. It becomes more extreme. It reaches for the most dramatic interpretation available. It catastrophizes. It generalizes from a single painful event to a sweeping conclusion about your life, your worth, your future. A business setback becomes, "I am a failure." A relational conflict becomes, "I am unlovable." A health concern becomes, "Everything is falling apart." These cognitive distortions feel like accurate perceptions of reality when you are inside them. They feel like clear-eyed recognition of truth, but they are not truths. They are stories, and stories can be rewritten. The most dangerous narratives are not the ones you voice openly. They are the ones that run in the background, so deeply embedded in your interpretation of life that you do not recognize them as stories at all. They feel like observations. They sound like, "I am not the kind of person who can handle this," or "Every time I get close to something good, it disappears," or "I always end up alone," or "I am too far behind to catch up." These background narratives function as filters through which every new experience is processed, continuously confirming themselves because the mind, through the mechanism of confirmation bias, is extraordinarily adept at locating evidence for whatever it already believes and dismissing evidence that contradicts it. The practice of narrative examination begins with one deceptively simple question: is this story actually true? Not does it feel true, because the most damaging stories feel utterly true while you are inside them. Is it factually, demonstrably, objectively true? And then, even if some version of it contains truth, is this the only story that fits the facts? Is there another interpretation, one equally consistent with the evidence, but less catastrophic, less self-defeating, less limiting? Is there a story that acknowledges the genuine difficulty without appending, "and this means I am broken, hopeless, or permanently damaged"? The most powerful narratives you can construct under pressure are not the ones that deny difficulty. Those are false comfort, and they collapse under the weight of reality. They are the ones that acknowledge difficulty honestly, while simultaneously holding space for your own capacity to navigate it. This is genuinely hard, and I have survived hard things before. I do not know how this will resolve, and I have worked through difficult situations in the past. I am in pain right now, and pain does not equal defeat. These reframes are not wishful thinking. They are more complete and more accurate representations of reality than the catastrophic alternatives, because they include the dimension of your own history, your own resilience, your own demonstrated capacity to endure and adapt. The story you tell yourself about what is happening right now is shaping your experience of it far more than the objective circumstances are. And changing that story is not merely a psychological exercise. It is one of the most concrete and consequential changes you can make. In any situation charged with difficulty, urgency, conflict, or uncertainty, there is an invisible dynamic playing out beneath the surface. The visible dynamic is whatever the situation appears to be: the argument, the crisis, the negotiation, the breakdown. The invisible dynamic is about who is governing their own interior state most effectively. And in that invisible dynamic, the calmest person always holds the advantage. Not always the most knowledgeable, not always the most experienced, or most senior, or most intelligent. The calmest. Because calm is not merely a pleasant emotional condition. It is a cognitive, strategic, and interpersonal resource of extraordinary power, one that most people voluntarily surrender in precisely the moments they need it most. The research on decision-making under stress is consistent and sobering. When the nervous system is activated, when cortisol and adrenaline are elevated, when the amygdala is dominant and the prefrontal cortex is compromised, the quality of decision-making deteriorates in measurable and predictable ways. people become more risk-averse in situations where risk is appropriate, and more impulsive in situations where caution is needed. They narrow their attention to immediate threats and lose the capacity to consider longer-term consequences. They become more susceptible to cognitive biases, less capable of weighing competing considerations, and more likely to make decisions they will later regret. This is not a character failing in stressed people. It is what the human brain does when it is in survival mode. It trades nuance for speed, wisdom for reaction, and strategic thinking for short-term threat management. Stillness is the deliberate practice of not entering survival mode when survival mode is not required. It is the ongoing training of your nervous system to remain within the window of optimal functioning, alert and engaged but not overwhelmed, responsive but not reactive, even when circumstances are applying pressure to push you beyond that window. One of the most important stillness practices is what contemplative traditions across cultures have called silence, the deliberate creation of spaces in your day free from input, stimulation, demand, and noise. Not merely the absence of sound, but the cultivation of genuine mental quiet. Time in which you are not consuming, not producing, not performing, not reacting to anything. Simply being present with yourself and with reality as it is. Modern life has made this extraordinarily difficult, and in many circles, nearly shameful. To be still is associated with being unproductive. To sit without doing is associated with wasting time. This cultural contempt for stillness is one of the primary reasons so many people are chronically overwhelmed. They have constructed lives that leave no room for the internal recalibration that stillness provides. Regular meditation, even in the modest form of 10 to 20 minutes per day of focused, intentional quiet, has been documented in dozens of peer-reviewed studies to reduce baseline anxiety, improve emotional regulation, strengthen attentional control, and reinforce the prefrontal cortex's capacity to maintain governance over the amygdala during high-pressure situations. But meditation is not the only path to stillness. Walking in nature without a device, sitting with a cup of something warm and genuinely tasting it, writing without an agenda. These are all expressions of the same underlying practice, the practice of being fully present with one moment, without resistance and without agenda, which trains the nervous system to rest and the mind to find its natural quiet. Calm is also contagious. The nervous system is a social organ. It reads the emotional states of other people constantly and automatically through tone of voice, body language, facial expression, and the pace and quality of speech. When you enter a chaotic situation carrying genuine stillness, not performed composure, not forced cheerfulness, but real internal ground, the people around you feel it. Their own nervous systems begin to regulate in response to yours. This is the neurological basis of what great leaders, great therapists, great parents, and great friends all share. The capacity to be a regulating presence for others. To lower the temperature of a room simply by being in it. That capacity is built not in the crisis, but in the daily practice of cultivating inner quiet long before the moment arrives when someone else needs you to be steady for them. Most of your suffering, if you examine it honestly, does not live in what is happening right now. It lives in a time that does not exist, in the future, in scenarios that have not occurred yet, but that your mind has already begun constructing in vivid and alarming detail. The conversation that might go badly, the diagnosis that might worsen, the opportunity that might not materialize, the relationship that might not endure. Your mind takes the uncertainty of the present and fills it, almost automatically, with the worst possible version of tomorrow. And then it makes you live there, makes you feel the full emotional weight of a catastrophe that does not yet exist and may never exist, while the actual moment you are in passes largely unwitnessed. Research on worry and its effects on both mental health and genuine preparedness consistently reveals that this is a lie the anxious mind tells itself. Worry does not improve your preparation for future difficulties. It does not generate better solutions. It does not protect you from adverse outcomes. What it does is consume the present moment, the only moment in which you have any actual power to act, to choose, to respond, to alter anything at all, in service of a future that exists only in imagination and that your worry will not modify. The present moment is not merely philosophically significant. It is neurologically the only location where your prefrontal cortex can function optimally. Your capacity for clear thought, wise decision-making, creative problem-solving, and genuine connection exists in the now. When your attention is pulled into the future, rehearsing conversations that have not occurred, calculating the probability of outcomes you cannot govern, you are not fully present, and therefore you are not fully in possession of your best cognitive and emotional resources. Viktor Frankl, who survived the Nazi concentration camps and went on to write one of the most profound books on human resilience ever published, observed that between stimulus and response, there is a space, and in that space lies our freedom, our power to choose. That space is the present moment. It is where you actually exist. It is where your choices are made, where your responses are formed, where your life is actually lived. The future is a thought. The past is a memory. The only thing that is real, the only thing you can actually do anything with, is now. Every time you choose to return to the present moment, every time you feel the mind beginning to spiral toward catastrophe, and you gently but firmly redirect your attention to what is real and immediate and available right now, you are not merely managing anxiety. You are building a new habit of mind. You are weakening the neural pathway that leads automatically from uncertainty to catastrophizing, and strengthening the one that leads from uncertainty to grounded, present-moment clarity. The discipline of presence does not require a meditation cushion, a retreat, or any particular philosophical allegiance. It requires, at its most basic level, the decision to bring your full attention to whatever you are actually doing, and to make that decision repeatedly throughout the day, as many times as the mind wanders away, which will be many times. You bring it back without drama, without self-criticism, with the same patient, steady firmness a skilled teacher brings to a distracted student. The mind has wandered. Fine. Return. This moment. This breath. This conversation. This task. This reality as it actually is. The practice of presence is also, it must be said, not only a tool for managing difficulty. It is the foundation of a fully inhabited life. The moments that matter most, the ones you will carry with you into old age, the ones that constitute what you would call a meaningful existence, are almost never the ones where you were efficient and productive and thinking 3 steps ahead. They are the ones where you were genuinely there, fully present with the person in front of you, with the view that opened unexpectedly, with the work that mattered, with the moment as it actually was, rather than as a backdrop to whatever scenario your mind was running. Anxiety steals presence, and presence, once returned to, reveals something that all the planning and catastrophizing in the world cannot. That the life worth living is mostly happening right here, right now, in the ordinary and extraordinary moments that pass entirely unwitnessed when the mind is somewhere else. There is an additional dimension to the practice of presence that deserves attention. What happens in the body when the mind finally stops fleeing forward? When the nervous system is no longer being asked to simulate disasters that have not arrived? When the mental bandwidth consumed by anticipatory dread is suddenly available, most people notice something unexpected. not just relief, something more specific than relief. A kind of perceptual clarity, the world becoming slightly more vivid, more detailed, more genuinely interesting. Colors a fraction sharper, sounds more distinct, the texture of an ordinary moment more apparent. This is not an accident or an illusion. This is what sensory experience feels like when the brain is not running parallel processing on imagined catastrophes. This is what it feels like to actually be somewhere, rather than to merely be physically located somewhere while your mind is elsewhere entirely. This quality of presence, available in any moment you choose to return to it, is one of the most practical and immediate rewards of the inner work this audiobook describes. It does not require months of practice before it becomes available. It is available right now, in this moment, in whatever circumstances you currently occupy, if you are willing to redirect your attention from the imagined future to the actual present. The practice begins immediately. The benefit arrives immediately. And with repetition, with the daily, ordinary discipline of returning, again and again, without self-judgment, without drama, it deepens into something that begins to feel less like a technique and more like a different relationship with time itself. A recognition that you have always been living in the present moment. The only question is whether you were aware of it. And awareness, cultivated deliberately and honestly, changes everything about what the present moment contains. Train yourself to be here. What you find will exceed what you were looking for. Every person who has navigated a genuinely difficult extended period, not just a hard week, but a sustained, grinding, disorienting stretch of time in which the usual sources of stability have been removed or compromised, knows a particular sensation. The feeling of drift, of being unmoored, of not knowing from one day to the next what to hold on to. The job is gone, or the relationship is over, or the health is uncertain, or the future that was so clearly mapped has been erased. And in its absence, there is nothing familiar to orient around. The person who organized their life around those external structures finds themselves floating. And floating, to the nervous system, feels indistinguishable from falling. What anchors people in those moments is not willpower. It is not optimism. It is not motivational content or the determination to think positively. What anchors people is practice. Specifically, it is the small, daily, embodied practices that create reliable islands of stability within an otherwise unstable experience. Practices consistent enough that the nervous system can begin to build certainty around them. Rituals dependable enough that the mind can use them as true north when everything else is shifting. These are emotional anchors. And in a period of genuine difficulty, they are not luxuries. They are survival. An emotional anchor is any practice that reliably returns you to a regulated, grounded state. One you engage in consistently enough that it becomes a structural feature of your day, rather than something you reach for only in crisis. The distinction matters enormously. A technique you attempt for the first time when you are already in full panic carries very little power, because your nervous system has no established connection between the practice and safety. A technique you have been engaging every morning for 6 months, by contrast, has been neurologically paired with calm so many times that simply beginning the practice starts to activate the parasympathetic response before you have even completed it. You are not just performing the technique. You are stepping into a well-worn groove in your neural architecture, one that leads reliably to ground. The most effective emotional anchors share certain qualities. They are physical. They involve the body, not just the mind, because emotional experience lives in the body, and regulation that bypasses the body is always incomplete. They are consistent. They occur at the same time and in the same way, with enough regularity that they become automatic rather than effortful. They are brief enough to be genuinely sustainable, because anchors requiring an hour of uninterrupted time become casualties of exactly the chaotic periods during which they are most needed. And they are honest. They do not require you to pretend to feel better than you do. They simply require you to show up for the practice, regardless of how you feel. Morning is the highest leverage time for anchoring. Not because there is anything magical about early hours, but because what you do in the first 30 to 60 minutes sets the neurological tone for everything that follows. A morning that begins with immediate intake of news, social media, email, and other people's demands before your nervous system has had time to stabilize from sleep is a morning that begins in reactivity. The brain's threat detection systems activated before the prefrontal cortex has fully come online, the entire day unfolding from that reactive baseline. A morning that begins instead with even a brief period of intentional quiet, 5 minutes of deliberate breathing, 10 minutes of movement, a page of writing by hand, 5 minutes of sitting with something warm and genuinely tasting it, is a morning that begins from ground. And the entire subsequent day is subtly different because of it. Movement is one of the most powerful emotional anchors available to a human being, and it is persistently underused as such. Not exercise in the performance sense, not the training regimen you feel guilty about skipping. Deliberate physical movement practiced with the specific intention of regulating your nervous system. Walking, particularly in natural environments, has been shown in research by Stanford psychologist Gregory Bratman to produce measurable reductions in rumination and activity in the subgenual prefrontal cortex, the brain region associated with negative self-referential thinking. 20 to 30 minutes of walking in nature, practiced consistently, does not merely improve mood in the immediate term. It gradually rewires the brain's baseline emotional orientation over weeks and months. You do not need to run a marathon. You need to move your body deliberately, regularly, and let it do what it was designed to do. Rituals of closure. Intentional practices that mark the end of periods of difficulty or demand are equally important and far less commonly practiced. The nervous system has no automatic off switch. Without a deliberate signal that a period of difficulty has ended and that it is safe to rest, the body and mind continue running the stress response long after the stressor has passed. A simple closing ritual, a few minutes of writing what you handled today, what you are grateful for, and what you will leave until tomorrow, teaches the nervous system that this moment is a boundary, that what happened today belongs to today, that tonight is for recovery. Over time, this kind of closure practice dramatically improves sleep quality and the capacity to be genuinely present in moments of rest. Gratitude practice deserves specific mention, not as a piece of positive thinking culture, but as a neurologically grounded anchor with a substantial evidence base. Research by psychologists Robert Emmons and Michael McCullough found that participants who wrote about things they were grateful for on a weekly basis reported higher levels of well-being, more optimism, fewer physical complaints, and greater life satisfaction than those who wrote about neutral or negative events. The mechanism is not mysterious. Gratitude practice deliberately directs the brain's attentional systems toward what is present and working, rather than what is absent and broken. And because attention shapes the neural pathways that govern emotional tone, consistently directing attention toward the good that exists alongside the difficulty gradually alters the brain's default orientation. The deepest function of emotional anchors is not just regulation in the moment. It is identity reinforcement over time. Every time you show up for your anchor practice, especially on the days you do not feel like it, especially on the days when everything is hard and the practice feels like one more demand on a depleted system, you are sending yourself a message. The message is, I am the kind of person who takes care of their own interior life. I am the kind of person who does not abandon themselves when things become hard. That message, accumulated across hundreds of repetitions, becomes a bedrock of self-trust. And self-trust, in the end, is the deepest anchor of all. There is something that happens to people under sustained pressure that is almost never acknowledged, but causes some of the most significant damage of any difficult period. They disappear. Not physically, emotionally, relationally. They pull inward. They stop reaching out. They become shorter, more guarded, more isolated. The people they love most, the ones they most need during the hardest times, become the people they are most unavailable to. And the reason this happens is not mysterious. It is biology. The same threat response that prepares the body to fight or flee also, in complex social situations, prepares it to withdraw. Connection requires vulnerability, and vulnerability to a nervous system on high alert feels dangerous. It demands energy that a depleted system does not believe it has. But the research on human resilience is unambiguous on one point above almost all others. Social connection is not a supplement to resilience. It is one of its primary biological foundations. Harvard's study of adult development, the longest-running study of human well-being ever conducted, found that the single most consistent predictor of who thrived through difficulty, who remained healthy, engaged, and cognitively sharp into old age, was not wealth, not intelligence, not professional
achievement, not physical health habits. It was the quality of their close relationships. People surrounded by warm, genuine, reciprocal connections consistently fared better through every form of adversity. People who were isolated consistently fared dramatically worse. The reason relationships protect us is neurological. Human beings are fundamentally social organisms, and the nervous system co-regulates with other nervous systems in ways that individual self-regulation cannot fully replicate. When you are in the presence of someone who is genuinely safe, someone whose presence your nervous system has learned to associate with warmth, acceptance, and non-judgment, your parasympathetic system activates in a way that mirrors the effect of the best breathing or meditation practice. Being genuinely seen produces real and measurable changes in cortisol levels, heart rate variability, and brain activity. Connection is physiological medicine, not merely emotional comfort. The most significant barrier to connection under pressure is shame. When life falls apart, when the failure is visible and the gap between where you are and where you thought you would be is undeniable, shame functions as a quiet poison that makes isolation feel not like withdrawal, but like protection. Shame says, if the people who care about me really see what is happening, they will see me differently. They will see weakness, inadequacy, failure. And so the self makes itself unavailable for the scrutiny of love. Research by Brené Brown on vulnerability and shame has documented this mechanism with precision. The antidote to shame is not more self-protection. It is the courageous act of speaking the shameful thing to a safe person, which invariably produces not the judgment shame predicted, but empathy. The recognition that the person on the other side has also known failure, also known fear, also known the gap between who they are and who they imagined they would be. This does not resolve the crisis, but it breaks the isolation. And breaking the isolation is, for many people in genuine difficulty, the single most transformative thing that can occur. Now, consider what happens on the other side of suffering. Not the recovery from it, but the growth through it. History is full of people who were diminished by what happened to them, and equally full of people who were enlarged by it. The difference is not in the severity of the suffering. Some of the most genuinely transformed individuals in human history endured circumstances that resist any comfortable description as character building. The difference is in what they chose to do with the suffering, the meaning they refused to let it lack, the uses to which they put everything the difficulty had forced them to discover about themselves. Post-traumatic growth is not a motivational concept. It is a clinically documented psychological phenomenon, first formally studied by psychologists Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun, who found that a substantial portion of people who had experienced significant trauma reported not just recovery, but genuine growth, improvements in personal strength, openness to new possibilities, depth of connection with others, appreciation for life, and existential understanding that they attributed directly to their encounter with what had nearly broken them. The research does not suggest that trauma is desirable or that suffering should be welcomed. It documents that the human psyche, given the right conditions and the right orientation, is capable of not merely surviving difficulty, but of being genuinely enlarged by it. The first condition that makes post-traumatic growth possible is the willingness to fully process what happened rather than bypassing it. The cultural instinct in the face of pain is to move on as quickly as possible, to be okay, to return to normal. But psychological research is consistent. Pain that is not processed does not disappear. It goes underground. It continues to shape behavior, relationships, and emotional experience from below the surface, often in ways more disruptive than the original conscious encounter with the difficult thing would have been. Processing means sitting with what happened, in honest conversation, in journaling, in therapy, in whatever form allows you to move through the experience rather than around it, until you have genuinely integrated it. The second condition is meaning-making, the active, deliberate construction of a narrative about the experience that places it within the larger arc of your life in a way that is honest, complete, and ultimately purposeful. Meaning is not found in painful experiences. It is made. Viktor Frankl's fundamental insight, forged in conditions of incomprehensible suffering, was that the last human freedom, the one that cannot be removed regardless of external circumstances, is the freedom to choose one's attitude toward whatever happens. Not to approve of it, not to minimize it, but to decide what it means, what it points toward, what it has revealed, and what you will do with what you now know because of it. This meaning-making process cannot be forced or rushed, but it is worth holding as a question, worth returning to with increasing honesty as the acute phase passes. And when answers arrive, even partial, imperfect, uncertain answers, they are among the most powerful forces available for converting suffering into something that does not merely end, but transforms. The long game of resilience is built across several dimensions. Physical first: sleep, movement, nutrition, the basic maintenance of the biological system that makes every other form of resilience possible. Relational next: the deep, genuine, reciprocal connections that require ongoing investment during ordinary times, precisely because they need to be strong before the crisis arrives. Financial margin, spending less than you earn, maintaining reserves, avoiding structures that leave no room for the unexpected, because financial stress is among the most corrosive sources of psychological pressure available. And the difference between 3 months of reserves and none is the difference between experiencing a job loss as a serious challenge and experiencing it as an existential emergency. Purpose, next. The presence in your life of something that matters beyond the immediate and the personal. Because people who possess a genuine sense of purpose are consistently more resilient in adversity. Purpose provides a horizon that remains visible even when the immediate landscape is obscured by difficulty. And finally, skill. The skills addressed throughout this audiobook: emotional regulation, narrative reframing, physiological self-management, acceptance, presence, identity clarity, the capacity to process difficulty and extract meaning from it. These are not abstract ideas. They are functional capacities that are either developed or undeveloped. The person who has never practiced emotional regulation when it was not urgently needed has very little access to it when it becomes urgent. The person who has been practicing it for 2 years, imperfectly, inconsistently, but genuinely, has built something that is available in crisis because it was built before the crisis arrived. Now consider the version of you that exists on the other side of everything this audiobook has described. Not a perfect version. Not someone who never struggles or never feels the full weight of what life delivers, but someone fundamentally different in their relationship to difficulty. Someone who faces hard things from a different foundation, with different resources, from a different orientation toward what is happening and what can be done about it. What changes first and most visibly is your response latency, the time between something difficult occurring and your reactive answer to it. The untrained mind responds to disruption almost instantaneously, driven by the amygdala's alarm systems before the prefrontal cortex has had any opportunity to weigh in. The trained mind still feels the initial surge. The training does not eliminate the amygdala's function, nor would you want it to, but it has built, through thousands of small practices and chosen responses, a reliable pause between stimulus and reaction. And in that pause lives everything. In that fraction of extended time, the wise self has the opportunity to ask, what is actually happening here? What do I know about this? What matters most in this moment? What would the person I am committed to being do right now? What changes after that is your relationship to uncertainty itself. The untrained mind experiences the gap between what is known and what remains open as threat, a space that must be filled immediately with either information or worry, because the uncertainty itself is intolerable. The trained mind, through accumulated practice,
Sitting with what is not yet known, of being present in the unresolved, of making genuine peace with the open question, begins to develop tolerance for ambiguity. Not contentment with everything being unknown, the capacity to remain functional, grounded, and even genuinely curious in the face of what has not yet been determined. This tolerance is not passivity, it is freedom. It is the liberation of enormous psychological resources previously consumed by the desperate, futile attempt to resolve every uncertainty before it resolved itself. There is also a change that occurs in the texture of your ordinary days. The days when nothing is particularly wrong, when life is proceeding at its normal pace, and there is no obvious crisis to manage. Most people in these ordinary days do not experience genuine peace. They experience something closer to waiting, a low-level vigilance, a background hum of unease, a sense that the absence of crisis is merely temporary. This is the posture of a nervous system conditioned to expect threat and never given consistent evidence that rest is safe. The trained mind, over time, unlearns this posture.
as a baseline condition, as the default state of a mind that has been consistently returned to the present, consistently anchored in values rather than circumstances, consistently given the experience of coming through hard things and finding itself intact. The waiting quiets. The vigilance softens. And in its place, something emerges that most people, in the honestly examined depths of their experience, have always wanted and never quite trusted themselves to have. A genuine, embodied, day-to-day sense of being okay. Not the okay of every problem solved and every uncertainty resolved. The okay of someone who knows from practice, from experience, from the accumulated evidence of their own life, that they can handle what comes. The work described here does not promise that life becomes easy. Genuinely difficult things will still arrive. Loss will still come without warning. Plans will still collapse. There will still be mornings when the anxiety is high and the resources feel depleted, and the gap between who you want to be and who you are managing to be in that moment is wider than you would like. But what changes, reliably, demonstrably, increasingly, the longer and more genuinely you practice, is the duration, the intensity, and the meaning of those experiences. The difficult thing still lands, but you recover faster. The panic still rises, but it does not stay as long or reach as deep. The story still turns catastrophic sometimes, but you catch it sooner and revise it more skillfully. Each repetition of the practice, each chosen, grounded response, each moment of returning to the present rather than spiraling into an imagined future, all of it accumulates. The interest rate on inner work is extraordinary, and it pays out for the rest of your life. Here is what you need to understand before you close this audiobook and step back into the life waiting for you. The calm you have been building through these chapters is not a mood. It is not a state you arrive at once and maintain effortlessly forever. It is a practice, alive, dynamic, requiring your ongoing participation and your willingness to return to it even when you forget, even when life makes returning feel impossibly difficult, even when the person you are in your hardest moments seems to bear very little resemblance to the person you are committed to becoming. That distance between your hardest moments and your highest aspirations is not evidence that the work has failed. It is the terrain of the work itself. Every time you notice you have drifted from ground and choose to return, you are not failing. You are succeeding at the actual practice, which is not staying calm effortlessly, but returning to calm intentionally, again and again and again, for the rest of your life. That return is the practice. That return, made thousands of times in thousands of ordinary moments, is what eventually makes calm not something you do, but something you are. You have the understanding now. You have the framework. You have the tools, the science, the philosophy, and the practical architecture of a mind that can face what life delivers without being destroyed by it. What comes next is not passive. What comes next is the choice, made today, and then again tomorrow, and then again in the moment after the one that tries. To pull you off course. To show up for your own interior life with the same seriousness and consistency that you would bring to anything else that genuinely matters to you. One breath taken with intention. One story examined with honesty. One moment of returning to the present when the mind would rather run. One choice to respond from values rather than react from fear. That is how this is built. That is how it has always been built. And you, right now,
In whatever circumstances you are carrying, with whatever difficulty you are navigating, you are already building it. The only question is whether you will keep going. Keep going. The life that is waiting on the other side of this practice is not a life without hardship. It is a life in which you meet hardship as someone who is ready, grounded in what cannot be taken, clear on who you are, and genuinely equipped to face whatever comes with something that never needed to be earned or inherited or given. It was always in you. You are simply learning, finally, how to access it. This is mind psychology, and this is where your training begins.
I used to think calm was something you either had or you didn't. This changed everything. The moment I understood that panic is biology, not weakness, I stopped being ashamed of falling apart. And that was the beginning of actually putting myself back together. 3 years of anxiety in 1 hour of listening. This is the audiobook I needed at 22. I'm 34, and it still hit like the first time someone finally told me the truth. I paused at the amygdala hijack section and just sat there. That was me. That has always been me. And now I finally understand why. This is not about being positive. It is about being honest with yourself in a way most people are too afraid to be. That honesty is where the real strength starts. Box breathing saved me in a parking lot last Tuesday. I thought I was going to lose it completely. 2 minutes. That is all it took. I drove home steady. The dichotomy of control is the single most useful idea I have ever encountered. Epictetus figured this out 2,000 years ago, and most of us are still learning it the hard way. I have listened to hundreds of hours of self-improvement content. This is the first time I felt like someone was describing my actual mind instead of a generic version of a human being. What got me was the part about identity. I lost my job last year, and I genuinely did not know who I was anymore. Now I understand why, and I know what to build instead. I replayed the section on rumination 4 times, because I realized I have been calling it problem-solving my entire adult life. The fact that calm is a skill and not a personality trait, that sentence alone is worth everything. I am not broken. I am untrained. There is a difference. I started the morning anchor practice 8 days ago. 8 days. I cannot explain what has shifted, but something has. The ground feels more like ground. This reached me at 3 a.m., when the spiral was at its worst. I put in my earbuds and just let it talk me back to something that felt like myself. Thank you does not cover it. The acceptance paradox, that is the one. I have been fighting reality so hard for so long. I did not know that the fighting was the problem, not the thing I was fighting. Sarah Lazar's research on neuroplasticity nearly made me cry. The idea that my brain can physically change, that I am not stuck in this, that is the most hopeful thing I have heard in years. My therapist has been trying to tell me some version of this for 2 years. Hearing it explained through neuroscience made it land in a completely different way. Sometimes the science is the door. I sent this to my brother, who has been going through the hardest year of his life. He texted me 3 hours later and just said, "I feel less alone." That is everything. The inner citadel. Marcus Aurelius had it right. You can take everything from a person except how they respond. I am building mine, starting today. Most content tells you what to do. This explained why. And the why changed everything about whether I could actually do it. I have never heard anyone describe the feeling of losing yourself when life falls apart so accurately. I thought something was wrong with me specifically. It is biology. It is human. It is survivable. The part about stillness being a strategy, Not a weakness, not laziness, but an actual competitive advantage. I needed to hear that. I have been confusing busyness with strength for years. Gratitude practice always felt fake to me, until this explained the neuroscience behind it. Now it feels like maintenance, like brushing your teeth for your brain. I have listened to this 3 times in 2 weeks. Different things land each time. That is how you know something is genuinely true. It keeps giving. The storyteller in your mind is not reporting reality. It is constructing it. That line stopped me cold. I have been trusting a narrator who has been lying to me for 30 years. This is what mental strength actually looks like. Not hardness. Not the absence of feeling. The capacity to feel everything and still choose who you are going to be. That is it. That is the whole thing. The physiological sigh. I tried it right then and there while listening. I felt my chest open. 20 years of shallow breathing, and it took one double inhale to remind me what breathing actually feels like. What this audiobook did that nothing else has managed to do is make me feel like a student rather than a patient. I am not broken. I am learning. That shift matters more than I can express. I work in emergency medicine. I see amygdala hijacks happen to my colleagues every single day. Brilliant people making poor decisions under pressure because nobody ever taught them what was happening to their brains. This should be required listening before anyone enters a high-stakes field. The section on values-based identity versus circumstance-based identity is the most practically useful psychological framework I have ever encountered. I have been circling this idea for years. Hearing it stated this clearly felt like finally seeing a word I had been trying to spell. I started crying at the part about losing yourself when life falls apart. Not because it was sad, because for the first time, someone put language to something I had been carrying without words for 3 years. The research on social connection as medicine, not metaphor, actual medicine, reminded me to call my sister. I had been pulling away because I was ashamed. I called her instead. That phone call was more therapeutic than anything I have done in months. Graduated exposure. The idea that every time I face something that frightens me and survive it, I am literally rewiring my brain's threat response. I have been avoiding things my entire life, thinking I was protecting myself. I was making the fear bigger. The 4-7-8 technique at 2 a.m., when the thoughts would not stop. I did not believe it would work. It worked. I do not fully understand why I am surprised by science doing exactly what science said it would do. What I appreciate most is that this never once told me my feelings were wrong. It said, your feelings make complete biological sense. And then it showed me what to do with them. That combination, validation plus direction, is rare. I have been in therapy for 4 years. This audiobook did not replace that work. It illuminated it, like turning a light on in a room I had been navigating in the dark. Everything I had been working on suddenly had a map. The long game section is what I needed most. I have been treating resilience like a crisis response, reaching for it only when things break. This reframed it as infrastructure, something you build during the quiet seasons, so it is there when the storms arrive. 17 minutes into this, and I already felt less alone than I have in months. That is not a small thing. Loneliness in difficulty is its own separate weight. This lifted some of it.